You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Suzanne Feldman on the show with me. She has an amazing new book. It's called Sisters of the Great War, and this is one of the most fantastic historical fiction books that I've had the pleasure of reading this year. It takes us back to World War I, the story of sisters who go on this life-changing adventure together and separately, and this is a phenomenal book. You're going to love it. Welcome to the show, Suzanne.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for saying such wonderful things about my book.
Oh, you are so welcome, and it's absolutely deserved. Suzanne, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, that's a good question. So there I was in preschool, and I would stand on a chair and tell all my preschool classmates about the Three Billy Goats gruff, and they never got tired of it, and I'll never forget doing it. So that was my first. I was like, before I could write. So I've always enjoyed telling stories, and I continue to enjoy them now.
Did you come from a storytelling family? Was this something that was, that in the genes? If you look at it that way.
Well, my dad wrote a book, and I know my mom wanted to. My dad wrote a book about his experiences during the Holocaust, where he was a refugee during the war. And so we heard that story, we heard his stories a lot at dinner. So, they were, frightful stories, but they were always interesting the way he told them. So I would say that is probably where it comes from.
I love that so much. Suzanne, a lot of people that have been on the show kind of have this epiphany somewhere in life where they just know that they have a book in them, and that it will come out. And then, very few of those people that I've talked to had kind of a singular purpose in life, and everything that they did and everything career-wise and education-wise always pushed them closer to that goal. Most of the people that have been on the show took a sort of a circuitous route and came back around to writing. Which one of those are you?
Well, I'm a really driven person, and I would like to say that I'm the kind of person who, all roads point to writing. When you got to go to work, you got to get a job, all that kind of thing. Sure. And my degree is in art. So I went to work as an art teacher in high school for 27 years, but the entire time I was writing books. I worked full time sometimes, and I worked part time sometimes, because it was, depending on where I was in my writing career. So I went to Johns Hopkins for the creative writing graduate program in 2004, and that was really my springboard, I guess, into different kinds of writing, like literary fiction and romance fiction and things like that. And it's just I retired in 2015, so it's been like the last 5 or 6 years. It's just been writing, and it's what I've always wanted to do full time, and now I get to do it. It's awesome.
That is awesome. So tell me about the first book that you got published, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you also write under a different name?
In the early 90s, I wrote under a pen name, Severna Park, and I published 3 science fiction novels. And the first one was called Speaking Dreams, and it was published by Firebrand Books, a small feminist press, in 1992. And that was amazing because it took me like, 2 or 3 years to write the book. And then, I started making some calls, and the editor, Nancy Bariano, took it 2 weeks later. So that was astonishing to me. And it kind of opened the door to, other venues. So I wrote 2 more science fiction novels under Severna Park. And then, and I won a Nebula Award. And then I kind of, didn't have any more science fiction ideas. So I went to Johns Hopkins and kind of changed directions and started using my real name.
I love that. That is an amazing story. What that first book that you published with the small press, was that the first novel that you had written?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah. So you the 3 science fiction books that you published, and now Sisters of the Great War obviously is historical fiction. Do you feel a tension between the side of you that loves science fiction and the side of you that loves historical fiction, or do those things is there no conflict as far as you're concerned?
Well, it's interesting with both science fiction and with historical fiction, in that with science fiction you kind of have to invent the background and the lives of the people and things like that. But with historical fiction, it's already there, and what you have to invent are the people who fit into it. So it's it's a different kind of invention, but it's I don't know, I really enjoy it. For me it's a huge challenge, and I love really hard challenges.
Well, with science fiction and fantasy, really particularly world building is kind of the cornerstone there. And and with historical fiction, like you said, your world is already built, and these kind of or these tentpole events are historical fact, and you write around them. And did you find any were there any challenges with creating a story? Because this is the interesting thing about historical fiction, is that the historical fiction fans are very particular about the things that you get right and the things that you make up to fill in the cracks. So how did you decide what historical facts would be in the book, and how do you kind of play with what is real, what is make believe, and kind of merging those together?
Well, there was a war, and
There
people
was.
fought in it, and worked around the edges of it. And I think that's kind of a hard question to answer, but when I wrote the book, there were certain historical things that happened, events that happened, and one was, and this isn't in the book anymore because it made the book too long and it just didn't fit. But there was an attack on the Germans by the British at the Messines in Belgium, and the Messines are like a little tiny mountain range because this part of Belgium is mostly flat, and so they had tunnelers, like British miners had tunneled under basically what was a swamp, and had set explosives to blow up the German lines. I mean, we're talking about like a mile of tunnels. And the Germans heard about this and they tunneled back. So, and this is, I thought, one of the most compelling scenes in the book was the miners would run into each other underground in the dark with candles and pistols, and they would kill each other underground. And it was, I mean, it's unbelievably horrible. And that war was unbelievably horrible. But, you just, you have to work around, like you said, the tent poles of history to make it a convincing book. And there's just, Fortunately, World War I was well photographed and extremely well documented. So there's a lot of tent poles to write around.
Yeah.
And you just kind of have to find, the right people to populate that fiction. One of the things that I used as a resource was the diaries of nurses that have been published within the last 15 or 20 years, and they're amazing. I mean, it's just the amount of stuff and just crazy stuff that they had to deal with. And some of the memoirs and diary entries are like, this is terrible and I can't wait to leave. And some of them were like, oh, these soldiers are so happy. I'm so happy to help them. Let's have a party.
You're
So
right.
a wide variety of responses. I'm not sure
So-
if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. So after writing science fiction, and then you go to Johns Hopkins and you start kind of thinking about other creative pursuits. What was it about this time? Well, first off, have you had a love for historical fiction? Is this a genre that you personally love to read in?
I think it's very interesting. And I'm not sure that historical fiction is something that I, delve into deeply in terms of being a reader, but I do like the nonfiction around, especially World War I. It just, it's just opening doors to, just that era.
Sure.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to ask me the question again.
No, I was just saying that. Are you a fan of historical fiction?
I am, but I find I get more from reading the nonfiction versions of history.
Sure. So, what was it about this time period, or were there specific events? What was it that initially grabbed your imagination that you said, I really want to write a story based here?
Well, the stories of the nurses were pretty compelling, but a book that I read, it's called All Not So Quiet, and it's obviously a riff on All Quiet on the Western Front. And it was written right after the war by a woman who drove an ambulance. And she wrote down all the gory details. And that is the book that I pretty much used as a touchstone for this one, for the character of Elise, who is the ambulance driver. And all the ambulance drivers were women because all the men were fighting. So they, aside from the fact that, women weren't supposed to get, dirty or shot at, the ambulance drivers were both dirty and shot at, and it was just not a ladylike existence at all. It was really, really dangerous. But that was a real inspiration. And the other thing was that, as I had finished the last book, which was called Absalom's Daughters, I was like, what should I write next? Because, I wasn't going to stop.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'd like to write a war book, but everybody does World War II. So I think I'll do World War I. And that was kind of my starting point with all this.
Dabble is a proud sponsor of Author Stories. Dabble is an easy-to-use cloud-based writing tool that gives writers a way to organize, plot, and create amazing stories wherever they are. Write in our desktop app on your Mac or Windows computer, tablet, or mobile device. Dabble syncs your latest version with the cloud on all your devices. Write anywhere and anytime inspiration strikes. We got you. Dabble is my preferred writing tool, and I think it will be yours as well. Visit dabblewriter.com for your free trial. You have an amazing story idea. You execute the writing and editing flawlessly, and now the only thing missing are readers. We can help you go from author to author superhero with Story Origin. Story Origin is a one-stop shop for marketing tools with a community of amazing authors working together to find reviewers, build mailing lists, increase sales, and collect feedback from beta readers. Everything an author needs, all in one place, from providing review copies or beta copies reader magnets to ensure you stay connected with readers, easily distribute audio promo codes, universal retail links to send readers directly to the proper point of purchase, or provide direct download links for members of your mailing list. Story Origin has all the tools you need in one easy-to-use site. Use the promo code ASP21 at checkout when subscribing to the yearly plan, and you will get 10% off your first year. This code will expire December 31st, so hurry over and subscribe now. StoryOriginApp.com.
Well, one of the things that was so interesting to me is that the role of women in World War I is highly glossed over in historical in our history.
Mhm.
World War II, you see a lot of the women's roles in that, but when you start going farther back in history,
Mhm.
I've heard almost no stories of the women's role in World War I, and I was surprised. Like the ambulance corps, like you said, all the men were fighting. Well,
Mhm.
that's just not something that I've ever heard talked about.
Yeah,
So
it's
of course they would be almost completely staffed by women. But why do you think that history is so one-sided like that?
well, history is written by the victors, and men were the victors. um, you don't really hear a lot about the ambulance drivers. You don't really hear a lot about the nurses because I guess, their roles are like, oh, well, they're just nurses. They're going to be nursing. Ambulance driver is going to be driving around in the ambulance, unless you're Ernest Hemingway, who drove an ambulance in Italy, in which case you are, mentioned. But one of the problems with World War I is that, when you try to write about it, and you try to write about the men in the trenches, is that the trenches never moved. It was a war of, it
Right.
was just attrition. And, they would fight for, a couple of yards, and then they would get beaten back those same couple of yards. And it was just nuts. They would send in, cavalry across no man's land where they were, inevitably just slaughtered. But the point I'm actually trying to make is that because the conflict is so long and so without a point, it's very difficult to write about it unless you've written All Quiet on the Western Front, which kind of sums up the whole war. And so once you get into the sort of peripheral characters like ambulance drivers and women, then it starts to get a slightly different slant. And yeah, I mean, women are they've been neglected in World War II also until, very recently. So it's, women in war it's kind of a tough thing to write about if you haven't really done the research.
Sure. Well, and you could see these glaring holes in the historical accounts,
Mhm.
and you could approach this in a way. I'm going to write a book about the unsung heroes of World War One and the women who had vital roles there and who are left out of the stories. You
Mhm.
could write that book. You could also write a book like you did, Sisters of the Great War, where you bring all those things out, but you attach the story to characters that we love and we you know that just we connect with and we want to go on an adventure with them. And in both of those have their place, but I think that the one of the great things about fiction and historical fiction, like we're talking about in this context,
Mhm.
is that you can learn so much, but you feel like you've gone on an adventure and it doesn't feel like it's learning. Um, Tell me about the Duncan family. How did you come up with them, and what did this family and their unique relationship to one another? How did that kind of spark the story?
Well, as you know, they live in Baltimore, and strangely, they live in the house that I lived in Baltimore. So, it was all very familiar to me. The house that I lived in Baltimore was built in 1910. So, so it had that feel. And whenever we played Billie Holiday in that house, it just felt like she had been there at one point. But the Duncan family, is fairly dysfunctional. They Marie Duncan, the mother, died in childbirth with Elise. And Ruth, who's the slightly older sister, always felt like she should have been able to do something about that. Her father, who is Dr. Duncan, refused to call a midwife during Elise's birth because he thought he could handle it himself, and did not do a good job. So there's this tension, where Marie isn't really ever mentioned in the household. The girls are brought up by a governess because their father is busy out being a doctor, and Elise grows up. In her teens, she realizes she likes to fix things. She can take a clock apart and put it back together, and it still works. And she is the one who her father kind of feels like is going to need the most help throughout her life, because she has basically no sellable skills as a wife and mother. She's just not cut out for it, obviously. But Ruth is the one he holds out hope for. But Ruth wants to be a doctor, and he refuses to let her do that because it is not done. And so both girls are kind of in rebellion. Elise is kind of in a sort of a purgatory of growing up, and Ruth just really, she wants to be a doctor. It's her goal in life. And the reason they go to Belgium is to follow her love, John Dowling, but also for her to get some experience as a doctor on the front lines where, her skills could be used.
One thing that I loved about this book is that over the course of the 4 years of the war, you carry us on this emotional journey that from when they arrive, that that there's all this excitement and all these new experiences and people and places, and you just there's a sort of a tangible excitement about it. And then as the war progresses, it gets darker, and the characters are more worn down, and
Mhm.
it's a real emotional journey. Was the pacing of that was that something that you mapped out ahead of time, or was it just kind of an emotional growth that happened as the story came out?
It was pretty organic to the story. I'm in writing terms, I'm not a plotter. I'm a pantser. I plot by the seat of my pants.
Sure.
Because I like to see what happens next, even though I don't know what that is. Yeah, I mean, 4 years is a long time to be in that kind of situation, and it does get darker, and it does get more and more grim. And there are points when it looks like the Germans are going to win the war, there's a point where the hospital Ruth is working in is actually bombed by a German airplane, and the chaos that ensues. So yeah, I mean, they become more, their outlook becomes a little bit more jaded. They're they're tired, and by the end of the book, Ruth is just a mess. So, and Elise kind of has to lead her out of the field and onto the boat that goes back to Britain.
I'm amazed at how people went through these traumatic experiences and then just went on to live life after that.
Mm-hmm.
I look at my grandparents and things like that who went through World War II, and just the different people that they must have been before that.
Mm-hmm.
Were there what sort of resources did you use to? I know you talked about the nurses' journals that you had.
Mhm.
Were there any other resources that helped you really get the feeling of what these people were going through?
That's a good question. The book, Not So Quiet, is the one about that the ambulance driver wrote. She goes on and on about the war, and it's like a diary of her daily experiences. And then at the end, it's just like, she's from London and she goes home to London and she's just like, here I am in my house. And that was the end of the war. And it's sort of, there were big parties and celebrations and everybody was glad, but, it was too early for PTSD to be recognized. They called it shell shock.
Right.
And people who, were emotionally crippled by, being bombed, were not dealt with in terms of their mental health. So a lot of people just, it's that British stiff upper lip that they were expected to keep. And, nobody cries because they're upset about the war. You just go on and live your life. And it is odd. It's very odd.
When you write about when you write a historical account of characters, especially in wartime, I've read a number of books based around World War II, especially, and then some in World War One. Some of those accounts choose to not go into very graphic detail about the war scenes, and choose to focus more on the character. Other books give you a harrowing look at the realities of war. Sisters of the Great War has some very intense battle scenes, and you really get to feel what the characters are feeling through the horrors of war. What was it like to write those more graphic, harrowing scenes, and how important was it to portray war the way war really is?
I think it's really important to portray war not as, sort of a grand expedition, but as a sort of a bloody mess.
Right.
I'm hoping that, maybe this will discourage some people from fighting.
That would be
But
good.
wouldn't that be great? But one of the sources that I used was American Heritage books of photographs from World War One and Smithsonian and things like that. And the pictures are just, for me, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so when you see, these, trains that have been flipped over by bombs and every tree is burnt to a stick, and there are bodies lying around, and in the midst of this is a wooden, what's called a duck board, which is laid across the mud so that soldiers can go into the battlefield or into the trenches where there's more mud, because it rains a lot in that part of Belgium.
Mhm.
And it just never gets dry. I'm getting off on a tangent here.
No, go
Okay.
ahead.
All right. But, when you see these pictures and you just wonder how anybody could have, survived any of that stuff. But it's important, I think, to bring the reality home, because without the, the conflict of the war, how do characters grow? And I suppose, I could have written it, with the war in the background, but I really felt like, for it to be a good book, a gripping book about World War One, I needed to talk about the war in pretty graphic detail.
Yeah. Suzanne, I know you said that you're a pantser, how you like to write. Are there any specific tools that you use that make that easy, or are you a writer that just opens a Word document and just starts writing? Are there any organizational tools that help you as a pantser?
That's a good question. It's it's okay. So I've been writing a long, long time, and my first publication was basically 30 years ago. So at this point, I have faced all my writing fears. And when I see a blank page, it's just like, well, I bet I can write a word on there. So generally what I do to kind of get ready to write is I take my dog out for a walk in the morning, and we either go to the mountains or the river, or we go around the neighborhood, and I get my thoughts in order. And we get back, and I start writing. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll look at the like what I wrote yesterday and do a little editing just to get back in that groove. And then I write till I have 1,000 words, and it usually takes me 2 to 4 hours. And then I say to myself, "You are a hero," and I go eat lunch. So you have to have a lot of self-confidence to do this.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Sisters of the Great War is out everywhere when you're hearing this. On the release day of this episode is release day for the book. And in the show notes of this episode, we're going to have links where you can grab it in Kindle edition or paperback if you want to hold the paper in your hand, or audiobook. Suzanne, have you gotten to listen to any of the audiobook yet?
What was really exciting was auditioning the readers.
Oh, yeah.
It was awesome. I have never been able to do that before. And so we listened to like 6 little excerpts of people. And I feel like we chose the best one because she had a little, like, not so much laughter in her voice because it's not really a funny book, but she had that little spark of life that I thought would really bring the text to life.
Oh, I love that. I can't wait to hear it. We're going to have links in the show notes where you can grab it in any format that you like to consume books. It's available everywhere today. Suzanne, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
I have a website. It's suzannefeldman.net. And all my books are there, including my short story collection, which has my Nebula winner in it. And you can buy from Amazon if you like, or you can buy from bookshop.org.
Excellent. And if your local bookstore is been having a tough time through this pandemic that we've gone through, support your local bookstore as well. Suzanne, this has been so much fun chatting. We're going to link up everything in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find you and to grab Sisters of the Great War, which is out available everywhere today. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The ancient building wore the severe cassock colors of a Puritan minister, a uniform monochrome of slate-gray shingles and soot-gray clapboards, its shadowed upper windows cross-hatched like the facets of a spider's eye. The second story protruded beyond the first and bore the house's only ornament, 2 gray teardrops of wood, weeping from each corner of the building's stiff upper lip. The place would have looked sinister and foreboding in its shadowed alley if not for the die-cut silhouette of a dancing sheep, jaunty above the door, and the 2 front bay windows that blazed with colorful, welcoming light. The windows were hung with orbs of colored glass on staggered lengths of ribbon. Each orb glowed with autumnal reds and delicate greens, burgundy tints and pumpkin hues, dappled raspberry and clover lime, streaked with light and weightless as bubbles over a cauldron. The shelves below offered crystal skulls and silver daggers and horny devils, Celtic chalices and woven dream catchers in dreamcoat hues. A primitive broom leaned in a corner, ready for flight, and a rhapsodic nude in bronze clutched her goat-legged lover beneath a jackal bust of Anubis. The interior of the shop was even witchier. Above a crude and sooty fireplace, A stack of brick barely holding the shape of a chimney pushed through the barn-high roof, threading ancient beams that crisscrossed overhead. Brooms and kettles and Christmas lights dangled from these, alongside Halloween costumes and Chinese umbrellas, pointy hats and bundles of herbs. Jason wandered deeper into the shop. His fingers trailed across strange bronze statuary and Aztec masks of turquoise and lapis lazuli. He rolled his eyes at the luck candles and money charms, but goggled indecently at a nude and anatomically correct silver nymph with long golden hair that reminded him of Kate. "See anything you like?" Jason jumped, turned, and jumped again. The woman standing before him was the living embodiment of every hippy-dippy counterculture type he'd ever seen. Her hair was green, her face pale and round, her doughy body wrapped in some elaborately woven ethnic garb. Her eyebrows were black and pierced in little rows, and her eyes were heavily circled with midnight blue, as if she'd been sucker-punched by an oil slick. She tapped the glass over the nymph. "Admiring the goddess, I see." She'd practically caught him with porn. "You want to hold her? She won't break. Here." The woman flipped open a glass door and handed Jason the naked figure. "See how heavy she is? You could bang her against the wall all day and barely make a dent." She waggled her eyebrows, obviously enjoying his discomfort. He checked the price tag. $700? "The goddess is a symbol of love and fertility. Don't be ashamed of desiring her." The woman's long green fingernails plucked a long black cigarette from a long red case, and she lit it. "I sense," she blew smoke and studied its whorls, "dissatisfaction in love. Yes? I have just the thing." She pulled Jason into a side room where the smell of her clove smoke gave way to the skunky aromas of potpourri sachets, tea leaves, and hanging clutches of twiggy flowers. She searched, found a little bundle, and pressed it into his hand. "This will make you irresistible. Rub it on your nethers twice a day, and love shall surely find you." Jason made a face. The bundle smelled like cow manure. He didn't even want that on his hands.